have with us Dr. Raghavendra Ramanjulu. He is the lead pain and palliative care medicine at Aster CMI Hospital, Bangalore. Welcome, sir. Sir very kindly accommodated this session because Dr. Gayatri unfortunately was not available to do this session today. Thank you very much, sir. I would welcome you and request you to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Dr. Vasudha. I would like to thank Rainbow for giving me this, hospitals for giving me this opportunity. Basically, I'm not a pediatric palliative care specialist, but I've learned a lot from Dr. Marianne Mukherjee. She actually was the head of palliative care services at Tata. So she's been my teacher and guide for pediatric palliative care services. So she has done a lot of. Hello?
We can hear you now, sir.
Yeah. So Madam actually is currently the professor at the Department of Palliative Medicine, Tata Memorial Hospital. I think without further delaying much, I would like Madam to take over the dais and deliver how to integrate palliative care in the journey of childhood cancer.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dr. Raghavendra. Thanks to the organizers, Dr. Vasudha and your whole team. As you probably hear, it's all about teamwork. Palliative care is all about teamwork. So without much more ado, I think you can see that I'm attached not only to Tata, but different hospitals. But my passion from when I did my MSc in 2002 was always in pediatrics. So I chose the pediatric option, and I should just take maybe 30 seconds to tell you that the reason that happened was because Dr. Dinshaw, who was our head those days, I was doing pediatric radiation oncology, and she says, no, I am not going to allow you out of the department of radiation because you're going to burn out if you do only palliative care. So you must continue doing pediatric radiation oncology along with palliative care. So that's where I started my career. And thanks a lot that this session is about cancer, but I'm just putting this up and I hope that you guys will get access to these slides sometime. Just to remind all of us that pediatric palliative care is not only about cancer. It started in cancer, just like the history of palliative care in adults also, but it also is used for many, many, many conditions in non-cancer in pediatrics. And I'm hoping, Dr. Vasudha, that you will also be admitting patients in your hospice who are of non-cancer. So maybe that's one of the reasons why I put up this slide. But let's go back to cancer and let's look at this child whose photo I put up with her permission. And if I had a longer period of time, I would have been asking all the participants to tell me what were some of the issues that she would be facing. And it would always happen that because she's a case of OGS with that big tumor over there, and she has lung mets, they will talk about all the physical symptoms. But I would have to prod people to remember that she's a young girl. She's probably, I think when she was with us, she was about 17 years old. So she's a young girl on the verge of adulthood, probably with so many dreams and aspirations. And it's all has been, put to the ground because as you can possibly see, she doesn't even have her limb there anymore. And she's the tumor, which you can see is actually grown up on the, on the shoulder region where there was a disarticulation done for her. So it's not only physical suffering. And if I could request each and every one of you to think about each and every patient of yours in cancer who come to you with progressing disease, all these children up to the age of 18, but even when they are young adults, like in the West, they don't stop at 18, but they go on into young adults till the age of 25. They all have so many psychological issues of body image, of where am I going from here, of why has this happened to me? So the social and the spiritual and the social reasons, how much of money would have been spent by the family in the treatment, and now the tumor has come back, and then they wonder that, oh, if I had more money, maybe my child would have been saved. So there are so many questions which come up. And therefore, again, I'm reiterating, please, as doctors, I think all of you on this training are doctors today. Please don't just think like doctors, and please do not think that a person has only physical suffering. Please don't think that it's the cancer that you are addressing alone. You are addressing the cancer because that's what you are trained for. But you are also addressing the person who has the cancer. And therefore, there would be a host of psychological, social, and spiritual. And these are just some of the things I'm just going to flash through fast. Because if you had to go to the textbook of palliative care for children, and we are now in the 3rd edition, you'll see that yes, there are some common symptoms in cancer, and some of them will recur and recur. But then you will also have symptoms like fatigue. You'll have symptoms like dyspnea. And Kusum, she definitely had a lot of dyspnea because of the lung metastasis. And some of the symptoms you will find easy to treat, but some of the symptoms are not so easy to treat, like the fatigue and the dyspnea. But then we also are looking at the psychological, the social, and the spiritual. Okay. So please, these are some of the common things which come up in our patients. They have a lot of anxiety. They don't know how to discuss, whom to discuss it with, because they're away from their peers who they would have discussed it anyway with otherwise. They have feelings that was I responsible for this. Many OGS patients think that because I took out the cycle and I did what my mother told me not to do and I fell, and that's how I got the tumor in my knee. They have self-image massive problems, so they will not want to have their body mutilated. And how much do parents actually discuss with their with the children, with their other siblings, as to what is happening and what is the concept of death? And I think all of us are guilty as parents that we treat our children not at the age appropriate, but at least 5 years younger. So if we had to think of each and every child who comes to your clinic and who has disease which is advancing, just think about how do you think if you were in that situation, not what your parents would think, not what your siblings would think, but just think what you would have thought if you were in that situation, and how would you like that discussion to take place. Okay, and yes, there's a lot of literature also on this. These are not concepts just out of my brain, but each and every concept that I talk about, there is a backing of literature. So if you get the opportunity, I hope you will read all these papers. The need of the parents, how the parents would like to not only understand what's going to happen in the terminal phase, but they would like to discuss how the home is going to be like after the child dies. They'd like to think about what should I do at the time of the funeral? What about my other children? Should they be brought? Should they not? They'd like to discuss their fears and what is the dying process actually going to be like. So again, think about in you as a team member, looking after these patients as the oncologist. Would you be willing to discuss all these things? Well, if you're not, then let's go through what is palliative care and hope that in a little while, all of you will think that, yes, I can do these things. And we have to never lose sight of the fact, as World Medical Association says, as Convention of the Rights of the Child says, that the child has a right. And we, in India, especially with the paternalistic medicine and the fact that we talk only to parents, we forget that the child has a right. May not be a right to consent, but the child at least has a right to be told about what's going to happen and what should be their to discuss with them what would be their wants and their needs, and then take it forward. So we all know that this concept has been there from time immemorial. This is a 16th century quotation, that when we are not just treating the cancer, which is probably what all of us are doing today, but we are treating the person with the cancer, and therefore we need to look for those symptoms which the child may not tell you. You may be only concentrating on the cancer. You may not be concentrating on the pain or the dyspnea or the fatigue or the inability to play, not being allowed to be with my peers, not being allowed to go to school. There are 100 things which children want to do, but if you don't address them, you will not be able to comfort them. So that was 16th century, and here we are in in the modern medical era, where again we are talking about, of course, let's not lose sight of the fact that we are talking about life-limiting conditions alone. We are not talking about all those patients who you were discussing just now. I was enjoying listening to the discussion on the cases. We are not talking about curative or even potentially curative patients. We are only talking about those who have been declared as life-limiting and therefore will not be cured of the disease. So whatever time which is left for them, we need to have this total approach, this teamwork. We need to look at the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. We need to look at the enhancement of the quality of the life for the child and also for the family. Sorry. And the only way that we'll be able to do that is if we manage their symptoms, provide them the care, the respite, through the illness, through the death, and into the bereavement. So that's what palliative care is about. And again, I'm not reading these goals because they are kind of almost like the 10 commandments which have been given to us. It's something like that. But what do I want to emphasize? One, it's team. Two, that we are now, because we know it's life limiting, we are willing to accept that dying is going to be part of the living of this child, for the parents, for the peers, for the extended family. And therefore, there's going to be a lot of support, which we are going to keep giving to them with the need of a team. So as all of you will probably realize, well, I can't do each and everything that she's talking about. No, you don't need to. If you have your team around you, you're going to be able to do the same amount of time that you would have given for your oncology consultation. You may give 5 minutes extra, but then you're going to have your team there to take care of all the other issues. And then the team is going to come back to you and tell you these are some of the issues. And then you're going to again try and look at it together. So it is applicable early in the course of the illness. And we're going to go through this a little bit. A busy slide, not to read, but just to tell you that in pediatric palliative care, as we've already shown, and just wanted to show you that this is literature. Again, physical, social, spiritual, into the bereavement, team support for each other, etc., etc. Okay, and this has been endorsed by the Indian Academy of Pediatrics, by the UK, by the Australia, by New Zealand. I think in India, we are lacking a little bit behind, but having this seminar today has really made it wonderful, because as you can see here, it ensures that all clinicians have this basic palliative care principles which are taught to them, and then they will use it in the larger context. So what are we talking about? Symptom relief, psychological, and teamwork. And I'm a very great believer in teamwork, and that's why I'm going to start with the team first. But if the team doesn't look at things in sync, if we don't have these meetings, family meetings, if we don't have our joint clinics, if we don't discuss each and every patient threadbare as to what are the things to offer and what maybe at this point of time is not to be offered, then we wouldn't have that, the common purpose of working together. And of course, we all very well recognize that the parents and the siblings are going to be part of that team, because when the child goes home, even for you, when the child is on chemotherapy or is on radiation, you're going to need the help of the family. So who are these team members for us? Well, in cancer, it's going to be the treating oncologist, the palliative care physician, the pediatrician, who is the community pediatrician, or the local GP. In some of the villages, there's no pediatrician. When we talk to patients who have gone home, there's no pediatrician, but there is a family physician who's going to help us. There may be even a Unani doctor, maybe a homeopathic doctor. It doesn't matter. It is that person who has all the care and compassion, who will make sure that what the child needs, the child is going to get. So again, it's about team, and on the team is going to be the nurse, the psychologist, So it's going to be the nurse, the psychologist, the rehabilitation person, the stoma, dietitian, whoever you need. But please don't think that because I mention all these names, it means that, oh, if I don't have all these people, I can't do pediatric palliative care. Of course you can. If in your own hospital, or maybe in the neighboring hospital, or maybe in the big cancer center which is there in your city, you're going to have all these members of the team, and you're going to be pretty surely going to be able to call on them whenever you need them. So you will, at least the minimum is the doctor, nurse, social worker, and a counselor. And what we have done, just to give you a bit of an insight, no one's going to pay us for this palliative care, doesn't get much budget. But what we do is we have projects. So right from the beginning of starting pediatric palliative care, we've always had one research project. And on that research project, the funding comes from the outside, but we've always had at least the nurse and the clinical psychologist funded by the project. So whatever the hospital is not able to give you, please use other means and ways in which you can get hold of these people. And of course, we have a lot of trained volunteers. And when I say trained, I mean they really go through a very rigorous training, but they are part and parcel and the backbone of what we do, our trained volunteers, especially in the pediatric world. And of course, if the child goes back to the home, you're going to have those ASHA workers, you're going to have any other healthcare workers, you're going to have the family, the extended family. So it's all part of that team. So now looking at the other thing in the triangle, which was the symptom relief, just to reiterate that I'm sure all of you are very much aware of it, that we don't just give ondansetron for vomiting. we need to evaluate the cause of the vomiting, because believe me, when you actually look at that table which is there for nausea, vomiting, you will realize that most of the nausea and vomiting which is caused in palliative care is not at all the same. It's from the dopamine chemoreceptor trigger zone, where the dopamine is the what you call it the trigger, and therefore it's not ondansetron which helps me. It helps you in radiation and chemotherapy 100%. But for me, it's going to probably be metoclopramide, and in more advanced, caused by morphine, I'm going to think of haloperidol, but I'm going ahead of myself. What am I trying to say is we need to evaluate in a very scientific manner the cause of the symptom, decide the management. In the management, again, can I use oral or do I have to do IV? I don't think I want IV, especially when I'm reaching end of life. I'm not going to be able to get access to the veins. So when I'm talking about my evaluation and decision making and the explanation to the families, I'm going to think what actually is going to work for this child in the place that the child is being cared for. And here I'm again going ahead of myself, because probably I would like that to be the home of the child. So when I'm explaining, I need to understand where am I going to take care of this child. I need to individualize. It's not only about protocols. Yes, we are in the era of protocols, but we need to individualize for that child, for the availability of medications, for the availability of the non-medications which the child is going to need. I need to see that I have proper supervision for whatever I would like to do for this child. And the small details, like if the child is vomiting and I'm going on increasing my morphine dose, I'm not helping, because of morphine is coming out and I know morphine causes nausea. And if I don't treat the nausea, I'm not going to be able to treat the pain. We also need to remember that when we talk about symptom management, we need to only correct the correctable. So I was listening to your earlier talk where we were, you're talking about the antibiotics and you're going by culture sensitivity. What is correctable for me? If my child has if my child has fever, it's very possible that at this late stage, it's not because of infection, but it's because of disease. So am I going to do a culture every 2 weeks when the child has fever? No, I'm going to go by my clinical judgment. And if I can clinically exclude the fact that there's an infection, then I'm only going to treat the fever. I'm going to treat with antipyrotics, and I'm not going to add the antibiotics. Similarly, if you would have been doing blood counts every week or every 2 weeks, depending on your chemotherapy schedule. So if I am not going to do that, I am not going to treat anemia, I am not going to treat thrombocytopenia unless I'm having issues of fatigue or I'm having issues of bleeding from the mouth or from the rectum. So that way we will only correct the correctable, and we will look at non-drug and drug measures together. Also need to think about, do I need to use cancer modifying treatment? Probably, knowing that pediatric cancers are very sensitive, the answer would be yes, but it would have to be extremely appropriate. Looking at the mouth, looking at the skin, treating, like I said, and of course, very often because of hypoproteinemia, they get lymphedema in their legs, sometimes even in their arms. But here again, I don't think I want to admit and give albumin. Probably I just want to treat the lymphedema. And whatever I'm able to treat the hypoproteinemia with oral, knowing that it's not going to help very much, I will only do that. So as I just said, you judiciously use whatever you have in your armamentarium, but keeping in mind always that the toxicity should never outweigh the benefit. So there are a lot of discussions we always keep having, and I'm just going over here to that. Lot of discussions we keep having as to when should we stop the chemotherapy, when should you give oral metronomic chemotherapy. I think all of you are very much aware of this work, which started about 15 years ago. But the important part is that every child is put on oral metronomic chemotherapy. We need to reassess, we need to decide whether it's helping. We need to discuss with them what's the role of Ayurveda and homeopathy, because they would be giving it anyway. And we need to accept the fact that when it's not working, we should be having that joint decision making between the oncologist, the palliative care physician, and the parents, that it's not working and now we may be needing to stop. Going back to the role of surgery, yes, sometimes amputations are there, sometimes stomas are there, sometimes debridement is there, sometimes it is fixing a bone so that the child will be able to walk on that bone with the necessary rehabilitation. etc., etc. Radiation, of course, we do use. I'm always calling up the radiation oncologist to say, please, can you give a single fraction or can you give a short fractionation just to get tumor shrinkage so that we'll get symptom relief. So these are, and as you can see, this child has had so many, so many tumors which have been excised, which have been radiated, and at least we are able to do a good symptom relief for him. So these are all things we have in our armamentarium, and these are all things which we are going to use. I'm just going to touch on symptoms. As I said, I'm hoping that you guys will get these slides, and therefore I don't want to use up maybe the 10 minutes I have left teaching you the symptoms. Just want to tell you that age appropriate, age appropriate diagnosis into the cause of the symptom is very, very important. So I hope you guys will go up and read about this quest where you look at a simple body chart, you look at a scale which is appropriate for the child, and you try to decide whether, even if it is, for instance, in infants, whether you need what scale you want to use. So with all these things in mind, we are able to decide how much is the pain the child has. And then you have guidelines where for the, again, this is a WHO guideline for the management of pain, where they talk about route, clock, ladder, but we also have added for children by the child, because as we know, each child is very different, very individual, has a lot of difference in metabolism, and therefore we have added for children the by the child. And again, looking at drug and non-drug measures. So the non-drug measures are as important and as appropriate in the management of the pain as compared to the drugs. We need to understand and get down to the level of the child to understand how severe the pain is and accept that it is as severe as the child says it is. But again, very, very importantly is the role of the mother, is the role of the father, because they can sense that this child is not eating, not moving a certain limb in a certain direction, etc., etc., and they'll be able to guide us a lot into exactly the amount of the pain and the site of the pain. And of course, you'll probably be bored of me by the end of this lecture, the concept of total pain, so that you need to look at the psychological, the social, and the spiritual elements. So for pain, the WHO changed the ladder in 2012, where they only have a step 1 and a step 2, because they decided that the step, so that the step 2 is actually the step 3 of the old ladder, because in children, they decided that those drugs which are in step 2, which is here, are not applicable in children. So simple for step 1 is paracetamol, ibuprofen in combinations, and we all know that celecoxib is part and parcel of our oral chemotherapy protocols, and therefore we use it a lot. And there is naproxen. Most of the other drugs are not ideally recommended, and this is again a 2020 guideline. In step 2 is moderate and severe pain. So like as I said, there's morphine, fentanyl, and methadone. However, there are other drugs which are still there on the step 2, like oxycodone, hydromorphine, tapentadol, buprenorphine, and tramadol. Some of them are not tested in children, but they can still be used as off-label use. Okay, and that's why, as you can see there, it says WHO pain guidelines do not recommend. So if we have morphine, fantastic. If you are able to get hold of methadone and use it safely because you have enough of experience, fantastic. If you have fentanyl, yes, go ahead and use it. Now there is a 125 mics patch, which can also be made half by blocking the other half. So you can use it even in smaller children. But otherwise, off-label use of tapentadol and buprenorphine in adolescents is part of our armamentarium. Okay. So I'm not going to read all these slides. I just put them over there. The only one that I wanted to cover actually is this one. Okay. And that's terminal breathlessness, where, as probably Kusum would land up in the after say a month or two, where there's no lung left for her. So however much I may try to, I may think of bronchodilators, this, that, and the other, I know it's not going to help. And therefore, the only drug which is going to help me here is morphine. I've given you the dose, and you have to review every 24 hours, sometimes even 12 to 24 hours. Go up on 50%. There are some of us who think that we can't really go beyond 10 milligram every 6 hourly. But there's another school of thought which thinks that you use it if it is giving you a benefit. But most of the time, to be very frank, it's true that after 10 milligram every 4 hours, you don't really get much of a benefit. You need to add the benzodiazepines to reduce the panic. And therefore, we usually use alprazolam, lorazepam. But sometimes when the patient is having too much of panic, you might have to use midazolam. And we all know that that spray is extremely useful to us. We've talked about non-drug measures. We're talking about, again, some literature here saying that this is kind of the things that we need to help patients and parents with. Some diversion therapy of this young kid who was 6 in the ward. These are all non-drug things which can really help us a lot. Whatever else you can use, Make-A-Wish Foundation, there are so many other things we do. Sometimes with the patients who are well, they are taken out for picnics, outings. Just do whatever you can to make these children as comfortable and happy as possible. This child wanted to have a 11th standard, we arranged the donation for her. And as you can see, those pretty little earrings were also given by the same donor. Just do whatever it is to make these children as happy as possible. Let's not forget the spiritual issues. Always, 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 children who are older, parents, they need to be able to cope with what's going on. It's not easy for them. It's very different from adults and it's very different for children. And therefore, to help them to understand what's happening and understand the larger meaning of life is very, very important. So from all that I've said, I think you will have very well understood that we need to start as early as we possibly can in this trajectory. So that is what the title was about, integrating. So in Tata Hospital, for instance, we attend the joint clinics, we attend all joint clinics. But whenever there's a child who's having a disease which is not responding too well, so there is resistant or relapse, then that's the time when we think about adding palliative care. Yes, there is a taboo on palliative care because parents immediately start thinking that their children are end of life. And therefore, we need the oncologist to help them to understand that this is palliative care we're talking about. It's not end of life care, it's not terminal care, but it is just supportive care. So I think there are many centers like Manipal where they don't even call themselves palliative care, they call themselves supportive care. I'm not one of those proponents. I think palliative care is a beautiful word. So I request oncologists to help patients understand that we are just sending you for care for a life-limiting condition, which includes psychological, social, and spiritual care as well. So as your role is going down, our role is going up. And yes, we are always into the death and into the bereavement. So that's where the continuity of care is benefiting if you get us in as early as possible. So we outpatient consultations, liaison, when we need to be in the home of the patients, we need to liaise with the local GPs, etc., to provide the continuity of care. And the two main concepts in what we are doing, in what we plan to do, like not treating sometimes, on three concepts. So the first one was in early integration. The second one is quality of life. So if the child if we have to perceive the subjective feeling of the child on physical, psychological, and social functioning, I think it's possible that I could think that the oncologist would probably like to join hands with us. So while they are doing the treatment, we can look at the quality of life to give the best physical, psychological, and social functioning to that patient, to the child and to the family. And of course, this is not against any of the ethical principles. Because when you think of the best interest of the child, I think sometimes not doing something which is more toxic than if you didn't do it, and you know it's a life-limiting condition, probably this is not maleficence. This is non-maleficence, and it's also justice. Because we know the health resources we have. In the country, we need to use it to the best possible way. So should this child be dying in a ward or in an ICU? In Tata Hospital, none of the children or even adults ever reach the ICU because we try to treat them with the best interest of the child in the ward itself. Okay, and then the last two concepts have been added by a palliative care person, and that is the dignity of the person who is living and dying, and the concept of informed consent and truth telling, which is truthfulness and honesty. So all this builds up into saying that if you don't do a certain treatment, we are still following the basis of medical ethics. Where's the ideal place? I would like you to think about if you can create something as happy as this in a very, very busy hospital, well, that's fine. Sheetal needed to go home, so we had to teach her mom how to look after the spastic limbs, the RICE tube, the medications, blah, blah, blah. She was very happy. She went home because then she could care for this child as well as all our other children. This is the van, this is going into the home of the child. But if this is the reward, I think, because the child is not being held, but the child is actually participating in the dressing, and you can see the wound is not something very great. This is a hospice where we don't try to put too many children. We try to put as less children as possible, because we would like to encourage home care. They can be in the midst of their own family, but for that we need to have the proper local help in any which way. There would be a huge topic on end of life care, so I'm not really going into that, just to emphasize that it's quality of life, and here quality of death, and that's a basic human right. And that is why you need to think about this concept of medical futility. Medical futility thinks about the benefit and toxicity, but it also looks at communicating with the family, helping them to understand. And you will obviously understand that I need the pediatric oncologist on our side when we want to help families to understand that, yes, I know you are suffering. I know you want your child to live forever, but it's not happening. So when we are trying to help the parents with that communication and helping them the truth telling and the honesty, then we need the oncologist there as well, because they are the ones who have been treating the child all along, and they are the ones who are going to help us to put it together for them, even though it means that they're going to lose their extremely precious child. Very rarely do we need to have access to the ethics committee or the courts. It's never really happened for us. So for that, you need to understand that we need advanced care planning. So things have to be discussed and communicated, Again, you'll understand the earlier you bring us on to the trajectory, it would help a lot. Supreme Court has allowed now advanced directives, okay? Just an algorithm for a good end of life care, which again says you need to have the team, and the team has to work along with the patient and the family. And just to coming to the end of my presentation, we don't stop our work end of life and death, but we go into the bereavement care of these families, because there are no grief counseling professionals who really work so much in our country as compared to others. And therefore, most palliative care teams would continue with the bereavement work, both for pediatrics and for adults, till they are able to move on. Okay, Dr. Vasudha, I hope I have not taken up too much extra time. And thank you very much for having given me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I think the take-home message is integrate palliative care right at the diagnosis, and I hope that all of us can do that. Thank you very much for your valuable time. Thank you, Dr. Raghavendra. If you want to add on something to ma'am's talk.
I think Madam has covered the entire topic extensively. But I think there are some pros and cons, negative connotations and thoughts. Most of the pediatric oncology people, though they are towards palliation, the negative connotations which palliation, the word itself, could actually bring towards the acceptance among the caregivers itself is a big impact. Convincing the hospital itself to understand what is the importance of palliation, how do we actually go about integrating from the day one. The administration should accept the palliation. Madam is talking about a hospital basis, which is actually more in towards a government setup. What we are talking about, a private setup, or what is going to be a corporate setup, that's very, very important over here. How do we integrate? How do we convince those people? So the palliative care physician actually, first of all, should build a team with not only with himself as a team members, actually should actually have a lot of camaraderie with everybody. And I think the palliative care physician should be well read. He should be actually having the understanding of what is the evidence going on, and what actually, like a policeman actually catches a thief. How do we catch a thief? He has to think like a thief. So in terms of that, if there are issues and concepts which are actually leaking through, problems are there with administration, other people, we have to think through how they are actually thinking across. So it's more in terms of understanding this and what are the pros and cons. I think integration is good, but at the same time, aggression, treatment, management plans, like coming to hemato-oncology, they do not actually get referred until the last moment. Now, how do we actually take that ahead? That is something which is very, very important to discuss and understand. And if every meeting, if you're sitting over there during the MDTs, I think that becomes a general consensus, and slowly you could actually build the teamwork with the oncologist. Now, as Madam did mention, saying that we need neurology, other aspects also coming in, wherein long-term patient stay is actually becoming more and more important, and how do we cater to those services also? I think incorporating those aspects also are important. To the last, I think how do we manage the transactional value for a corporate hospital? That becomes really, really important. And we need to show all these domains to the administration, also saying that we bring a lot of these changes, not only in just in actually bringing about quality, dignity of life and other things for the patient, for the caregiver, for, as Madam mentioned, importantly to all the other people, siblings especially, could be the other secondary group of people who are supporting the child. It becomes very important. And not the least, to all your colleagues, to yourself, burnout is the highest in pediatric palliation. When it comes to pediatric oncologists, pediatric nurses, especially BMT nurses, how do we integrate our palliative care services to actually care for them, look after them? That becomes very important. And by not the least, administration should be told, saying that we are actually looking and thinking towards you also. We also bring about transactional differences also in terms of that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And palliation is just not for government hospitals. It is for the entire range of hospitals which needs to be taken up. Otherwise, the aggression actually happens over here lot more than other aspects. I think that's where I would like to end my comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Mary Ann and Dr. Raghavendra again.